Hi, everyone. My name is William Schragis. I am a guest lecturer for the Culinary Institute of America and the National Director for Barrell Craft Spirits, craft producer of whiskey in America. And I'm here to talk about the modern whiskey brew. I'm going to take everyone through the basic production steps of making whiskey. And then we're going to talk about some brands that I think are really exciting and what they're doing in America right now to speak to the consumers that are looking for more information and more things to try. We're going to talk about the basics of whiskey making, what parts of production are important, and we're going to talk about the way that different brands are telling their stories right now. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what to look for in the brands that you're excited about and why not to take things too seriously. So quickly, a lot of whiskey brands talk about distillation being invented in Scotland and occasionally Ireland. And though the whiskey industry was invented there, distillation existed way before that. And so both in Greece and in Arabian cultures and actually Mongolian cultures as well, they found ways to bring vapor into something that they could drink and wouldn't be poisonous. And so it sort of fell away for a long time, but distillation didn't start with whiskey. So what is whiskey? Whiskey is a spirit that is distilled from grains of some type and is deliberately flavorful. The reason I say that is because vodka can also be made from grains, but the definition of vodka is being deliberately unflavorful, having no flavor or no aroma. There's lots of countries that produce whiskey, and there's lots of different rules about producing it, but each one of those countries have their own specific rules. And just other than being made from grains, there's no international rule about it. Some of the types of rules that exist that we'll go over are wood aging or oak barrel use, alcohol percentage in the way it's produced or the way that it's bottled, minimums of how long it has to be rested before you release it, and specific rules about which grains you might use. Whiskey's made all over the world, but there's really 5 main whiskey producing countries: Scotland, Ireland, the United States, Canada, and Japan. But there's an increasing number of really important producers in other places as well. However, none of those countries have really developed a specific national style. Much like in America, where we have really specific delineated styles like American rye and bourbon and American light whiskey. But then we have lots of really wonderful micro distilleries doing interesting things around the country. There is a lot of world whiskey made, but there isn't a really good way to talk about it as one whole thing. So Scotland, probably the country most famous for making whiskey, spells their whiskey without an E. If you noticed before, I put a parentheses around the E in a lot of places. They make 2 main styles. They make malt whiskey or single malt whiskey, which would be malt whiskey made at one single distillery. They make grain whiskey, which is whiskey that is often distilled to a much higher proof, has fewer restrictions about what you can do, and is used for blending in a lot of situations. In order to be called whiskey coming out of Scotland, you have to be aged for at least 3 years. So there is grain spirit coming out of Scotland that is less than 3 years old, but any Scotch will be at least 3 years old. Ireland, having similar rules to Scotland, also requires you to be 3 years old, but they spell whiskey with an E, which is why in America, most people spell whiskey with an E as well. We had a lot of Irish immigrants coming into America and bringing their spelling of whiskey, and a lot of Scottish immigrants going into Canada and bringing their spelling of whiskey. But they use 2 different types of stills, and we'll go over this a little later, but they use, and I guess just sort of remember this for now, what's called a pot still, similar to Scotland or single malt production, but they also use column stills, also known as continuous stills or coffee stills, which are a little bit more modern, and they're able to make more precise whiskeys, but potentially a little bit less romantic. The United States, which is the focus of the end of this lecture to some extent, because there's so much innovation going on here, and we are by far the most important, I don't want to say the biggest would be India, but the most important consumer of whiskey in the world. We have 42 different legally defined styles of whiskey. So if you think about bourbon, that's one legally defined style of whiskey. But even within bourbon, there's a blend of straight bourbons. There's straight bourbon. There's bonded bourbon. And even within those, there's some sub-classifications. There's no spelling rules about using an E or not using an E in the United States. However, the TTB, the government body that regulates labeling of alcohol, does use the E. So a lot of companies will drop the E for the front label, but then on the back label, when they're giving you the government alcohol warning and such, they will use the E, just so that they don't get into a sort of bureaucratic argument with anyone. Most of the whiskey made in America is based on corn. In fact, most of the alcohol made in America is based, or hard alcohol is based on corn as well. Partially because it's what we have here, and it's really because it's the cheapest commodity. And so if you're looking for just available calories for fermentation, corn is by far the easiest way to get there. Canada, which has very few rules about production, still allows their country to sort of compete domestically because they make it very expensive to import other alcohols. And so there's some really wonderful Canadian whiskey brands that only exist in Canada. And then there's some kind of frustrating or disappointing whiskey brands that come out of Canada that are branded really well, but actually don't really tell you a lot about how they're made on the label. Finally, Japan, which has seen probably the most extreme price uptick in recent global demand of whiskey. They've based their style mostly on Scotch single malts. And there's some really amazing attention to detail done in some of the old and new Japanese distilleries. However, they have very different rules about what is whiskey in Japan and what's whiskey outside of Japan. And so a lot of companies, both in Japan and sort of branding companies or import-export companies in other places, have taken advantage of America and other parts of the world's sudden obsession with Japanese whiskey. And they've created labels that are seemingly Japanese whiskey, but actually they are Scotch or American whiskey that's shipped over bulk to Japan and bottled there only for export. A really good example of this is in Japan, anything that is produced from rice cannot be called whiskey. However, because we allow rice whiskey in America, there are rice whiskey producers in Japan that have to label things differently domestically there, but they put the word whiskey on it when they export it, and suddenly those brands become really popular in other places. It's not to say that it's not wonderful and high quality. It's just a little bit misleading to the consumer in America. Some other parts of the world that make whiskey that I'm really excited about are Taiwan. There's a company called Kavalan, which makes really beautiful whiskey there. There's some really amazing indigenous corn variety whiskeys that are being made in Mexico. And I think that was really opened up by the emergence of mezcal. So we're seeing these sort of light, very interesting distillates coming out of Mexico because there's so much corn there and there's an interest in those whiskeys in America now. Wales has followed their United Kingdom siblings in making a bunch of really interesting whiskeys. India is the largest, as I said before, the largest consumer of whiskey in the world. And they have really right now 2, but soon to be probably like 5 or 10 really interesting whiskey producers. However, they have very loose restrictions about what they call whiskey as well. And the consumer base in India is still very driven by Great Britain. And so a lot of the major Scottish labels still are the most popular there. France also has started making a lot of really beautiful single malts. France has probably the largest supply of wonderful barrels to use. And so there's a lot of brands, both in America and in France, that are taking advantage of used barrels from really beautiful wineries to age or finish their whiskeys in. So quickly, just to bring everyone up to speed, because I know in a lot of these lectures, different people have different levels of knowledge about what the lecturer might be talking about. But I want to quickly, and I'm going to really blast through some of these slides so we can start talking about brands. I want to quickly go through how whiskey's made, because when we talk about the brands and when you go back to the slides about how different countries regulate their whiskey making, it's kind of important to think about how corn or malted barley becomes whiskey. So the first is the choice of your base product. And I've highlighted here the things that can be used to make whiskey in different parts of the world. On the left, you have all of the different grains, everything except for potatoes, which is really used for vodka, can be used to make whiskey in at least one part of the world. In India, there is sugarcane whiskey still made. I suspect there's sugarcane whiskey made in other parts of the world as well, but India is the one place that seems to be the big violator of that you have co-fermented. So you have a little bit of grain and a lot of sugarcane together to make whiskey. And that can't be called whiskey anywhere else, but you totally see it sneaking up onto shelves, especially in some of the Indian communities in America. So the first step, although I have a number 2 here, I guess, but the first step of real hard production is mashing the grains. So that means taking the starches that are in the grains, where all the calories are, and converting them into a type of sugar that yeast can eat when it's fermenting into alcohol. And you do this mostly through heat. So it's almost like making oatmeal. But there's also a lot of enzymes within certain types of grains that will help break down the starches, and that's called saccharification. When you're mashing, you have to make decisions about what temperature you're doing things at, because the enzymes that help create flavor and also thin out the mash, make it easier to work with, will also fall apart at certain heats. And so, really, traditional whiskey making will heat something up to a boiling point and then add different types of grains as it cools down slowly. And that's really imperfect, but with imperfections, as you'll see in a lot of these slides, you also find really specific house styles that are hard to mimic in large automated production. Second, you have fermentation. So at this point, the yeast eats the sucrose that you've mashed out of the grains, and it produces ethanol, which is the alcohol that gets us drunk. It produces carbon dioxide, which usually bubbles out of the mash. In some really amazing distilleries around the world, they've started collecting that carbon dioxide and either using it themselves as a beverage producer to carbonate things they're doing in cans, or selling it as energy or as carbon dioxide to other people. It produces energy in the form of heat, which is important because as something is fermenting, it heats up, which changes the way the yeast in the fermentation is acting. And then it creates a whole bunch of other large organic molecules that are seen as impurities in something like vodka, but they're the same things that are intricacies or cogeners in whiskey. And so the variety and abundance of these different molecules can't completely be controlled unless you were to absolutely control the yeast strain and the temperature of the fermentation, which is almost impossible. But you can do things about the way you're fermenting to get similar fermentations each time. Those cogeners, those flavor molecules or flavonoids, are affected by the species or the strain of yeast you use, and that really makes a huge difference. It's probably the thing in whiskey making that's talked about least that has the largest impact on the flavor at the end. The abundance of sugar that's available, and so I guess like humans, yeast make a lot more smells and flavors when they are stressed out and or hungry and or hot. But when they have plenty of food and they're nice and cool and they're not worried about what's going on, they generally make a much cleaner fermentation. And you get whiskey that doesn't have as many sort of tropical or funky notes to it. Finally, the acid levels in the water makes a huge difference. And so even though you see a lot of whiskey companies talking about their water sources, the truth is most of that water is now treated to be exactly the same as it comes in. There's very few whiskey companies in the world that still use natural water sources. This is just a quick slide with some names of different esters and cogeners and what they smell like. I don't go into this too much, but it is really interesting to look up if anyone is curious about trying to attach science to what they're smelling. Most of the things that you see in flavor notes or in tasting notes for whiskeys or wines are comparing things that you're smelling and tasting to foods that you would normally eat or smells you would normally come across. And most of them are not actually the same molecule. The one sort of fun fact exception to that comes up a lot is a chemical called methoxypyrazine, which is in mostly bell peppers, especially green bell peppers. And it's also in the seeds and stems of grapes and some other things that are used to make alcohol. So if you ever smell a wine or a brandy, it usually is that exact same chemical, methoxypyrazine, that has made it into the product. And if you smell it in whiskey, it's usually methoxypyrazine as well, but it was created through fermentation or oxidation. And there's no real reason to know that, except it's a fun fact to have in your back pocket if you're talking about alcohol with people. So what is distillation? How do we make something into whiskey in the end? You've got a fermented solution that contains all sorts of different compounds. So contains all of the different flavor compounds, and then it contains a lot of water and a lot of ethanol, which is, again, the alcohol that we think of as sort of drinking alcohol. And the boiling point of water and ethanol are different. And so as you heat that temperature up, the ethanol will evaporate or boil first, and it'll be collected on the top of the quote unquote still. and then recondensed back down in a sort of separate container. So the process of distillation is separating the parts of a beer or a base beer into its different components based on their unique boiling points. There are two main types of stills or machines that are used for distillation. There's varieties of each one of these, but in general, there is a pot still, which is a lot of the really more romantic pictures you see. They look like big pots with a top, and I'll have a picture of them in a second. And that's what single malt is used to make single malt in Scotland. It's what's used to make a lot of the brandies, especially cognac in France. It's what used to make some of the more traditional rums. And there's a lot of complexity and a lot of weight to what comes out of pot stills, but it's really hard to be consistent. It's really hard to get good yields out of them. And because of that, a lot of modern whiskey production is done on column stills or continuous stills or coffee stills, which is named after a man whose last name was Coffee, not coffee, the drink. They were created in Ireland, and they're much larger and more efficient. And I'll talk about them in a second, but you sacrifice some of the romance and some of the unpredictable but beautiful nature to be able to be really precise in what you're doing and to be able to recreate exactly the same liquid each time. When you are distilling, because there's different components to the beer that you're distilling into whiskey, you have to decide which parts of the final product or the final distillation you're going to keep in the product that you bottle. So these are some terms that are used for bourbon production. There's different terms for the same general process in other alcohol making and other whiskey making. I was originally trained as a bourbon distiller, and so this is how I think of it. But if you're ever in a distillery somewhere and they talk about heads, but they don't talk about foreshots, they might have a different word for foreshots. Foreshots are the very first thing that will boil, and it is almost completely alcohol called methanol, which is very poisonous to human beings. If you ever hear about people going blind from drinking bad alcohol, it's because whoever made that alcohol did not pull out enough methanol at the beginning, and they left it in the alcohol. I don't want to scare anyone, because the trace amounts of methanol that wind up in alcohol, even under mistakes, are very small, and they're not really a problem. There's methanol in beer too. There's just so little of it that it doesn't really bother anyone. The problem would be if you drank whiskey or other alcohol that was made incorrectly many times over the course of your life. You may start to see some nerve damage in and around your eyes as you get older. But I really wouldn't worry about it. I don't want to scare anyone with this. The second part is what we call the heads, and that is oils and other chemicals that are even lighter than ethanol. And so they sort of fall in the boiling point range between methanol and ethanol. And some of them are really beautiful in terms of their flavors, but sometimes there's too many of them, and they will, first of all, sometimes give people headaches and such, but they also might not have the flavors you are specifically looking for. And it's okay if you have those in your fermentation, because it's pretty easy to cut them out of your final whiskey. The third part of the distillation that will come out of a still is the hearts, and that's what eventually becomes the whiskey. So that's mostly ethanol, and it's all of the trace molecules that we really want to leave in the whiskey. And finally, we have the tails, which, similar to the heads, are the really heavy molecules and the beginning of water that's coming out. And a lot of times those have really off characteristics as well. So what most producers will do is they will cut out the foreshots and they'll use them to clean their distillery, or they'll sell them to a chemical plant. Then they'll cut the heads and the tails out of the distillation run as well, but they will put them back into the next distillation run because they have some flavors they like. They're just too concentrated. And you wind up with this sort of rotation of redistillation that happens. And that helps sort of create house styles as well, because it's impossible to start from scratch with that. You have to have months or years of heads and tails being redistilled each time to create the same distillation run. So I know we talked about it before. What is a column still? If you think about a pot still, which is really easy, you boil something and you collect what boils and recondense it as it boils. A column still is a series of different compartments that are all boiling and condensing and sort of recondensing things all at the same time, or continuously. That's why you call it a continuous still. So without going too far into it, if you imagine a vertical selection of chambers, each with a slightly different temperature and or pressure, so that the balance of how much alcohol and how much water and how much of whatever else you're distilling changes as you go from one chamber to the next as you move up. Uh, if you are doing that continuously, eventually the liquid will separate itself out in a pretty consistent way, and you can pull only the chambers you want out into your final product. And so it does the cuts for you in a lot of ways. However, it is constantly boiling and recondensing all of the fermented beer. And that will hurt some of the really beautiful, delicate molecules in it. And so it is not a gentle process at all. A lot of really wonderful things that come in more traditional spirits get lost if you put them in column stills because they just get destroyed by how industrial the product is. Most bourbon is made on column stills. You see a lot of pot stills on labels, but we don't see a whole lot of bourbon made on pot stills anymore. That's mostly because corn, especially commodity corn, when it ferments, throws a lot of off characters, and it's just easier to make them and cut them out than it is to try to avoid making them in the first place. The next step is flavoring, and there's not a whole lot of flavoring done in whiskey. There are what we see called flavored whiskeys, a lot of honey whiskey, a lot of cinnamon whiskey on the market right now, but they're not actually legally considered whiskeys. Some of them don't even have any whiskey in them at all. They're quote unquote whiskey flavored. I put this in here because there is a moment where after you produce whiskey, you have to decide if you're going to make a more traditional whiskey out of it or a flavored spirit out of it. Finally, number 6, maturing, is the area that a lot of whiskeys really gain their identity. And there's 5 sort of sub parts of maturing whiskey that I'm going to talk about briefly. They are all processes that happen simultaneously and they affect each other. And they're all really important decisions in what you're looking for at the end. The first is evaporation. So whiskey almost always is rested in wooden barrels, and wooden barrels are wonderful but deliberately imperfect containers. And so the ethanol and the water within the barrel that are mixed together now as a white whiskey or a clear whiskey will evaporate at different rates. And so the alcohol percentage will go up and down. And those rates will differ from each other and from other barrels based on the temperature and the humidity and the altitude and the fluctuation of all those things. So a good example of this is the same barrel in Martinique, which is a really beautiful rum producing island in the Caribbean, and Scotland will lose alcohol percentage at a somewhat similar rate because it's so damp in both places. However, because Scotland is so cold, the overall volume of alcohol and water that's lost is a lot less. So if you pull a sample from a barrel in Martinique and a barrel in Scotland 5 or 10 years in, the alcohol percentage might be the same, but the amount of liquid that's left in that barrel will be very different. The second is absorption. And so just as a barrel will allow certain things to evaporate, it will also suck certain things into the wood itself, and the wood will be a little bit of a sponge. And what's important about that is different parts of the whiskey will more easily be sucked into the wood. So depending on how porous the wood you're using is, you might gain or lose different aspects of what's aging in the barrel differently. Similarly, as we talk about next, the whiskey evaporating out or being forced back in, depending on the surroundings around the barrel, will affect the overall flavor of the whiskey as well. The next is oxidation, and this is probably the least talked about part of maturation, but maybe the most important. As whiskey leaves the barrel, air enters it for the most part, except for occasionally you see a barrel that is so tight that it will let things out and then it'll seal itself off again and it won't let air back in. And those usually create really fascinating, what we call reductive barrels, but they're very hard to plan for. And there's so few of them that there aren't very many brands that are based around it. But as air enters the barrel, the oxygen will dissolve back into the whiskey and it will start messing with some of the organic compounds that are in the whiskey. And these are compounds that were usually made in fermentation and then cut back in, so allowed to stay in distillation, and also compounds that are coming from the wood itself after absorption. I have an oxidation equation on the bottom, which we don't really need to deal with, but basically a lot of the flavor molecules that we talked about at the beginning, the things that smell or taste like certain foods, were not made in fermentation, were not made in distillation. Their parent molecules were made there, and then they were allowed to oxidize into what they taste like. So a lot of the most beautiful things in whiskey can only be made if you go through the steps of making them. And the step that's hardest to control is oxidation, because there's no real way to speed it up when you're making whiskey. It's really about being patient. Finally, filtration. The inside of most of these barrels is either charred or toasted, and that has to do with if it's direct heat or not. And that creates an active charcoal layer in the inside of the barrel. As whiskey is absorbed into it and then pushed back in, it will go through that active charcoal, and certain cogeners will stick to the charcoal and be pulled out of the whiskey. And so filtration allows for cleaning out certain off characters or purifying the whiskey in some ways. And it also allows for how much of the coloring molecules, or the things that may not add flavor but add the brown color to whiskey, will be allowed in or out, or will stay in the barrel. Most of those molecules are water soluble and not alcohol soluble. So you see a lot of really high proof spirits, and especially whiskeys in the world, that are not as dark. And that has to do with the type of charring that was done in the barrel, but it also has to do with the proof that it was entered at. There's a lot of scotch that is very light and very flavorful, and that's because it sat in the barrel at a very high proof. A lot of bourbon that's very dark and maybe not as flavorful as some of its siblings, and that's because it sat in the barrel at a lower proof. And that just has to do with the solubility of those flavor molecules. Finally, we have concentration. So there are certain molecules that are in such small ratios to the water and the ethanol in the barrel that we don't taste them at all. We call this being below perception threshold. Basically means at a certain parts per million, the human condition can't notice it. A great example of this would be corked wine. And so humans are extremely able to notice or sensitive to TCA, or the molecule that you get in corked wine. So even when it's about 6 parts per million in wine, we tend to be able to smell and or taste it. Most things we're not quite that sensitive to, but we are sensitive to at different perception thresholds. So if you have heavier molecules sitting in a barrel and they're below perception threshold, but then lots of water and lots of alcohol evaporate out and those molecules don't, they might suddenly pop back into perception threshold. We'll talk about this when we talk about blending briefly in a second, because keeping as many interesting, complex, delicious molecules above perception threshold while you're blending is often very difficult, because different barrels will yield different flavor notes. The next step is blending. So in Scotland, we talk about single malt and blended whiskey. And in America, we talk a lot about blended bourbon and straight bourbon. Blending is a word that means a lot of different things in the whiskey industry, because blended in Scotland means using whiskeys that are not single malts. But even within a single malt, it's still a blend, or what they call in Scotland, a marriage of different barrels. And so being able to take a lot of different components, barrels that may have been produced the same way, but are ultimately going to taste different because they were in different parts of the warehouse, so they had different environments, or because they came from different sets of trees, and different trees have wood, even if they're the same species, that produces tastes that are slightly different. Being able to produce something consistently out of those, and being able to predict what two things will taste when you blend them together, is really complicated, because they're going to have different proofs and they're going to have different sets of molecules, and the way that certain flavors will be pervasive as you scale up the blend you're doing may not be linear. That's often exponential, and it's often really hard to predict unless you have done that recipe many, many times. So when we talk about distilling, a lot of times the distillers from really famous distilleries and whiskey producers get the most fame, but it's the blenders that really have the job that takes the most time within any one specific space to understand. I would say that some of the blenders for like Johnny Walker, for instance, are some of the most talented people in the whiskey producing world, because they are forced to make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of cases of the same thing out of 10 or 15 or 30 or 100 different ingredients all the time. Finally, we have bottling. And even though this is mostly just putting the whiskey into the bottle, there's a couple of decisions that go into it before you bottle it. One of the major ones is how to filter the whiskey, because it'll have little bits of char and oak and dust in it. And one would think you could just run it through a cheesecloth or a strainer, but that won't always get everything out, because as the temperature changes, different oils and also pieces of dust will coagulate in the bottle. And so There are certain companies that will use just very, very fine strainers that they have to push the whiskey through. And then there's a procedure called chill filtering, where you bring the whiskey down to almost to the point where it freezes. And that forces a lot of oils to coagulate, and then you can filter them out as solids. And that was really popular for a long time. And it's especially popular in whiskeys that are bottled at around 80 proof or 40%. Um, but increasingly in the last 20 years or so, more and more consumers really want the flavor that comes with those oils in the whiskey. And so they're asking for things to be bottled non-chill filtered, which often means they have to be bottled at slightly higher proof as well to keep them stable. So now that we've gone through all of that, and I hope that that wasn't too fast, because I'm so used to being able to walk around the room and make sure everyone sort of is on the same page as what I'm talking about. And this is a first for me with a Zoom class. But now that we've gone through all that, I want to talk about some of the brands that are really popular in America right now. In terms of brands that have made major moves in the last 10 or 15 years, I kind of separate them into three different categories. One are older, really well-respected heritage brands that have been mainstays and have suddenly developed a sort of cult status around them. And it's gone from being able to find them in any liquor store to secondary markets looking to buy and flip them. The second are newer craft brands, much like the company I work for, Barrell Craft Spirits, that have been able to find audiences from making sort of more modern and specific messages, and also creating whiskeys in ways that people are interested in right now that they might not have been a long time ago. And the final is, and I put ultra here 3 times, the market for extremely expensive whiskeys. There have been whiskey collectors around the world and in America for a very, very long time, since essentially as long as we have records of people buying whiskey. But the number of people that are looking to buy whiskeys that are in the $2, $3, $20, $50, $100,000 range has grown exponentially. And because of that, a lot of producers of whiskey have launched new bottles and new expressions, or started changing the way that they're holding back and talking about their whiskeys, so that they can have that profit margin of selling something for $20,000 instead of $35,000. So the first slide I like to show, this is the Pappy Van Winkle series. This is the first question I get when people ask me about whiskey almost all the time. Pappy Van Winkle is a pretty old brand that was always well respected, but was a little bit of a secret within the bourbon nerd community until I would say maybe 15 years ago is when it really started to become hard to find. At this point, these bottles, which still sell from a distributor to a store for less than $100, will be on the internet for sometimes $2,000, $3,000. It's not that they are of higher quality, but they do have a history of being really wonderful and well sought and well thought of. But it's also that there's people who like chasing expensive and hard to find things, and they have become the poster child for that in the bourbon world in America. Yamazaki is a single malt made in Japan. It's, again, been available for a very long time and really well respected. But about 6 years ago, Yamazaki started being called for a lot more in America. The 18-year-old has probably gone from about $120 a bottle to about $500 or $600 a bottle in the last 5 years. Similarly, Nikka, which is another old Japanese producer, sort of fell behind Yamazaki. Once Yamazaki got really popular, people started looking for other Japanese whiskeys, and Nikka was the next place people went. There's some older Nikkas that are still available, but the Nikka 15 became such a cult status in America that they had to discontinue it. So if you ever see one, please do buy it, because they're not making it anymore, even though they still make a 17 and a 21-year-old expression. Strathyla is one of my favorites. This is not a distillery very many people have heard of. It's in very northern Scotland, and Strathyla is the base whiskey for Chivas Regal. And so as Chivas got more and more popular in Asia and in India, the company that owned Chivas and also owned Strathyla had to discontinue Strathyla. And so there's a little bit of a cult status looking for it now. And we've seen it reintroduced in a couple test markets, but at double or triple the price it used to be. This is a bottle of Wild Turkey that people call Cheesy Gold Foil. And that's not the official name, but that's the way that it was, that's the way it's referred to now. It was discontinued quite a while ago, but it is by many bourbon nerds around America considered one of, if not the best bourbons ever produced. And there was quite a lot of it made in the 90s. And so you do see it a lot. I was actually lucky to find about half a bottle of it in my grandparents' cupboard about a year ago. and I made a very happy event for some of my whiskey friends in New York with it. I like to point this out because it is not one that you see talked about very often, except in the depths of whiskey fans. But it is one that you actually accidentally run across quite a bit. So if anyone sees a cheesy looking gold Wild Turkey label, especially 12-year, in their house or in a friend's house or in a bar, make sure to try it because it's really a good example of what bourbon can be. Finally, we have the Buffalo Trace Antique Collection. These are 5 different expressions that a distillery called Buffalo Trace, which is owned by a company called Sazerac, produces. And much like the Pappy Van Winkle series, they are probably the most widely sought after series in America of American whiskeys. Not all of them have age statements on them. So some of them have a variety of ages. Although if you look at these from the left, you see the Sazerac rye, the Eagle Rare is an 18-year-old and a 17-year-old. In America, you have to label your bottle of whiskey with whatever the youngest whiskey is. And that's true in Scotland and in Ireland as well. Canada, for the most part, that's true, but there's some loopholes that you can get through. In some of the other smaller whiskey producing countries, there's a lot of loopholes. These are also really special whiskeys, and they were very easy to find as recently as maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Now you see people buying all of their alcohol for an entire year at one store so that when these are released, they can be at the top of the list of that store to have the option to buy them. It's pretty wild, but they are really delicious. Finally, Willet. Willet is a company that has been around for a long time, and they do a lot of independent bottling. So they are now, but they used to not be a distiller. They would buy barrels, much like the company that I work for does, and select them or blend them and then bottle them. And they have some old releases that are incredibly well thought of, and a lot of them have like random names too, which people really like to collect. So it's one of the more collectible brands in the world, and they have this really sort of nuanced, easy packaging that I think is really, really pretty. They're a fun brand to get into if you're trying to sort of dip your toe into bourbon collecting without having to break the bank, because there's Willets that are really affordable, and then there's Willets that are hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So now we're going to move into some more modern companies that I think are really doing special things. This is Hedonism by a company called Compass Box, and they're a blended Scotch producer. So they make what's called vatted Scotch, which is a blend that is only single malts blended together, and then they make blended Scotch, which is single malt and grain whiskey blended together. And they have a core range like this one, Hedonism, and then they make a lot of really interesting sort of single or special releases too. They are doing on a slightly smaller and more careful and nuanced scale what some of the major Scotch producers like Dewar's or Johnny Walker did a long time ago. And so if you are a Scotch drinker and you're looking for something new that's not too expensive, Compass Box is a brand that I think is really doing fascinating things. And their website has so much production information on it. It's a really good way to delve into like the intricacies of Scotch and learn about the different distilleries there. Balcones, it's a whiskey producer in Texas. They were the first American single malt producer to win blind tastes in Europe. And so you see the front bottle here, the Texas single malt is their sort of mainstay. However, they make a lot of really interesting products, including on the left, you see True Blue. And that is a corn whiskey made out of Texas blue corn, which I think is really fascinating. They're a really fun company as well. Teeling is a relatively new Irish whiskey that was started not too long ago, and they did a really good job hiring their production team. And 2 of the partners are sons of a man that owned a very large distillery in Ireland for a long time. So they had a lot of really good connections, a lot of really good access. They're making really wonderful things. In America, we see a lot of their sort of more standard releases. But if you ever go to Dublin, which unfortunately I know is a harder thing to talk about doing now than it was a few months ago, but they have a really wonderful distillery in Dublin, and there's a lot of really cool Irish whiskey there to taste. These are some examples of some of the more high-end Canadian whiskeys. And so Canadian whiskey didn't really have a champion for a long time. There were some really special Canadian whiskeys that stayed in Canada, but they never got exported. And we just kind of thought of it as an easy drinking, inexpensive product in America. And in the past couple of years, some of the owners of the large distilleries in Canada have started releasing more premium things. And some of them deliver and some of them don't. My favorite here is this Lot 40 cask strength, which is second from the right. Um, this is Ichiro's Malt Chichibu is a distillery in Japan that there's some wonderful videos of them on the internet. They are doing everything with so much precision that even though this was, I think, a 1 or a 2-year-old that was originally released, their bottles are some of the most sought after bottles in the world. And it's really exciting to see what they're doing. And they have a lot of history behind their distillery as well. This is Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn. I actually worked here for a little while as well. And they are making mostly bourbon, but also some other whiskeys in Brooklyn, in New York. And they have this typewriter font and this flask motif that people really like, and it's really fun to buy, really fun to give as gifts. But they also win a lot of awards for the whiskey itself too. So I always like to call them out as they were one of the first of the craft distilleries to really make it in America. Finally, here we have Barrell Craft Spirits. This is my company. It's a little bit of a shameless plug that I took part of the day off to do this lecture, and so I'm reticent to not mention my own company. We are a producer of spirits around the world, mostly bourbon, that work with distillers around the world to make blends of different producers. So this is our Barrell Craft Spirits bourbon. In 2018, this was named Best Whiskey Made in America. And there's some available right now, though it's sometimes hard to find. And at the end of this lecture, I'll put our website up there, and we have a way to find a bottle or ask questions about it if anyone wants to ask me about my day job. Finally, we're going to start to talk about some of the what I call ultra premium bottles. This is a brand called Macallan Fine and Rare that Macallan releases. They're single casks that they bottle once a year or so in a vintage way. So it lists the year that it was distilled. This is in 1976. These bottles go for usually $20,000 to $30,000 per bottle upon release, and some of the rarer casks have started going for more in the $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 per bottle. There's a couple of collectors around the world that are so into this that they have accidentally priced themselves up because there's so few bottles of some of these releases that once one person has bought 15 or 20 of them, everyone else knows that the price goes up. The community that's collecting them is so small. It's really interesting to watch the way that auction pricing works for these. This is the Eagle Rare 20-year-old, or the double Eagle Rare that was released. This is Eagle Rare has 3 releases now. They have a standard 10-year-old. They have the 17-year-old that I mentioned in the antique collection. And then recently they put this in place, and it is, I want to say, about 10 times as expensive as the 17-year-old is. So this is Eagle Rare, which is the Sazerac company, making an ultra premium out of what already was an ultra premium product. Dalmore, which is a Scotch producer, has always been famous for making really opulent, expensive whiskeys. But recently they have moved from sort of the $300 or $400 level to a lot of 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old releases that are also in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per bottle. And the reason I bring them up is, first of all, they're very big in the cigar smoking community, but also that I recently learned that their per dollar release or their product mix in America, which I would have assumed is mostly their $50 or $100 or $200 bottles, about half of what they sell is in the form of their $10,000+ bottles in America. And that was really new for me to see just how deep that went in terms of how many of these really expensive bottles are being moved in the United States. Finally, we have the Redbreast 20-year-old Dream Cask. They also have a 32-year-old. They have a 27-year-old. Redbreast is a really traditional Irish whiskey that was mostly pretty affordable, but very well thought of. About, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago, they released a 21-year-old to compete with Macallan 21. And it was extremely well received. So they've started innovating upward as well. And they have these really expensive releases now too that are hard to find, but really wonderful. We also have the Yamazaki, which we talked about as sort of gaining cult status earlier. This is a release they made. It's 18 years old, the same way the one that I showed earlier was, but it was aged in a Japanese oak called Mizunura. And this is about a $7,000 bottle. And so the fact that it is even more authentically Japanese has produced a lot of demand for it in America.